without further ado, I'd like to introduce our trainer for the session, our acting city purchaser and the acting director of the Office of Contract Administration, Sailaja Kurila.
Excuse me. Thank you, Nicole. I'm very pleased to be here to present to you an introduction to the city's procurement processes. As Nicole mentioned, I'm the acting director of the city's Office of Contract Administration, which is responsible for the procurement, much of the materials, equipment, and services that are essential to providing government services for the residents of San Francisco. As others have mentioned, the city's contracting processes are pretty complex, so I hope through this session I can help to demystify how the city procures goods and services. Next slide, please. So today I'll cover three basic topics, essentially covering the basics of city procurement, the general policies and requirements that are applicable to city purchases. Secondly, I will cover the processes that we must comply with for the procurement of these goods and services, or what we call sourcing or soliciting. And then finally, I will highlight the regulations that our suppliers must comply with when they are doing business with the city. Next slide, please. So procurement basics, next slide. So when we talk about public procurement, and particularly how the city and county of San Francisco goes about procuring goods and services, it's very helpful to group purchases into different high-level categories. At a high level, each of these categories or purchase types is governed by different sets of city rules and regulations. So the first category you see here is commodities and general services. Commodities, sometimes referred to as goods or products, include such things as fuel, office supplies, and street sweepers, as an example. General services, in contrast, are activities that are performed by people, such as janitorial services and window washing. I do want to point out our city laws make a distinction between what we call general services and what we call professional services, which is the second category of purchases. Professional services are those that require extended analysis, the exercise of discretion and independent judgment in their performance, and or the application of an advanced specialized type of knowledge, expertise, or training. Examples of professional services include architecture and engineering, design, accounting, and management consulting. So one way to think about general services and how professional services differ is to consider what's really being delivered. So the outcome of general services, such as window washing, typically is fairly standardized, and it doesn't change much depending on the service provider. Whereas with a professional service, what is produced is typically complex and highly specific to the person or company providing the services. As an example, Company A and Company B will very likely not produce exactly the same design for a bridge. Additionally, typically more risk is associated with professional services than with general services. So the third category of procurement that you see here is construction. This includes the renovation, construction, repair, demolition, alteration, improvement, excavation, or installation of what would be considered a public work. So that is any public building, structure, infrastructure, bridge, road, street, park, dam, tunnel, utility, or any other similar public facility. Note that the city considers the installation and repair of integrated furniture, fixtures, and equipment, or FFE, as construction. The fourth type of purchase is what we call non-purchasing. So some examples of this includes leases or rent, gift cards, and grants, among other things. And then finally, the city has a final category of purchases, those which are governed by their own special rules. And you'll see a few examples here, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail later on. Next slide, please. So the set of city laws, rules, and regulations that govern purchasing is what we at the city call purchasing authority. When purchasing, we also must consider who is responsible for and is authorized to make a particular purchase. As noted, each of these purchasing types is controlled by a different set of rules and regulations and is, in fact, administered by different departments. As suppliers, it's important for you to understand these differing sets of rules and policies and how they apply to the goods or services that you are offering. So commodities and general services purchases are ruled by Chapter 21 of the city's administrative code. The Office of Contract Administration is responsible for commodities and general services purchases, with some exceptions that I'll discuss shortly. Professional services purchases are also governed by Chapter 21 of the administrative code, with the exception of professional services that are related to a public work, such as engineering design. These types of professional services are ruled by Chapter 6 of the administrative code. So city departments take the lead in procuring Chapter 21 professional services, though OCA, or my office, provides final approval of those types of purchases. What we often call the Chapter 6 departments, or those that have special authority to perform construction, do the full procurement for public works related professional services. The fourth category here, and I will note for construction, as I mentioned before, construction involves the improvement of a public work or construction of a public work. Those services are governed by Administrative Code Chapter 6 as well. And it is there are very specific departments, as I mentioned before, the Chapter 6 departments that have full authority to perform that work. The fourth category, what we call non-purchasing, doesn't fall into the other three major categories. They are transactions that each are governed by various rules, regulations, policies, code, and/or charter provisions. Gift cards, for example, must be purchased in accordance to guidance and policy set forth by the Controller's Office. Grants to organizations, including nonprofits, individuals, other government agencies, and private companies, I would like to point out, are now subject to the new Administrative Code Chapter 21G, which will go into effect in January of 2022. In general, individual city departments are responsible for the non-purchasing purchases. And they are called non-purchasing. I know it's a little confusing, but they're called non-purchasing because they do not require approval by the Office of Contract Administration, which is also known as the purchasing division. So they go outside of the purchasing division. And then finally, certain purchases that typically would fall within the other three major categories, for example, construction, professional services, and some commodities and general services, instead have some special authority under very specific code or charter provisions. These special laws give departments their own special authority to conduct goods and services purchasing. The Municipal Transportation Agency, for example, may conduct its own purchasing under Charter Section 8 and does not need to purchase through the Office of Contract Administration. Also, all departments may purchase certain goods and services up to $10,000 in value under what is called Delegated Department Purchase Authority, or PropQ authority. Next slide, please. While the purchasing authority sets forth the rules for making a particular type of purchase, the purchasing instrument is what allows the city to conduct transactions for individual purchases. So there are two main types of purchasing instruments that we talk about at the city. The first is a contract, or what we call a supplier contract. A supplier contract is a document that codifies all the city's standard terms and conditions that a supplier must comply with in order to conduct business with the city, as well as a comprehensive scope of services or product specifications and the agreed upon pricing for delivery of specific goods and services required. Supplier contracts are lengthy, complex agreements, and they are generally prepared for recurring, multi-year, or as-needed purchases. And I would like to point out, in fact, they must be used for construction, professional services, commodity or general services, long-term or indefinite quantity contracts, as well as for grants, software licenses, and software services, to name a few. These types of purchases are typically the city's most complicated, longer-term procurements that pose the most risk to the city. The formal, sometimes negotiated supplier contract document protects the city most fully against this risk. Secondly is the purchase order, or PO. A purchase order is used for more simple purchases, specifically for the one-time purchase of a defined quantity of goods and services. It is both a transaction in the San Francisco financial and procurement system, as well as a document that sets forth very standard city terms and conditions. It is, in fact, the instrument that must be used in the financial and procurement system in order to encumber city funds before orders for goods or services are placed with vendors, per City Charter Section 3.105. The approval of a purchase order in the financial and procurement system essentially creates the encumbrance and commits the budgeted funds for a purchase until the obligation is fulfilled, canceled, or discharged. There are several types of POs. The first is a departmental purchase order, sometimes referred to as a Prop Q purchase order. As I noted before, under the Prop Q purchasing authority, departments may place their own orders for certain commodities and general services up to $10,000, including tax and shipping. These purchases do not need to be approved by the Office of Contract Administration. As such, the departments issue their own purchase orders, or again, Prop Q POs for these orders. The second type of purchase order is called a purchasing PO. A purchasing PO is used for the one-time purchase of commodities or general services with a value greater than $10,000. These purchases must be procured by the Office of Contract Administration, again, also known as the Purchasing Division. To procure items over $10,000, departments must submit a requisition to the Office of Contract Administration. Our office then completes a solicitation if needed and issues the purchase order to complete the purchase. And I'll get into solicitation requirements in a moment. Next is a non-purchasing PO, which is used for all other transactions that do not require OCA authorization, such as rent payments, subscription payments, gift cards, some types of training, and other items as well. And finally, a PO release, or a release against a contract, is a purchase order that is issued when purchasing the goods and services that are authorized under a supplier contract. So in this case, the city would have set up a more formal agreement for the recurring purchase of goods and services. The supplier contract sets forth the terms and conditions and creates the authority for purchasing those goods or services, but it does not on its own create the required encumbrance to complete the individual order for the items under that contract. So the PO release is the instrument that encumbers those city funds that officially authorizes the purchase of the contracted goods and services. Next slide. In brief, I just want to note that all Chapter 21 contracts, so those for goods and services, must be submitted to the Office of Contract Administration for review and signature. And with those submissions by the department must complete a checklist, which can be found at the website that you see here, the OCA Resources website. And again, so it is the city departments that complete these checklists. But I'm pointing these out here as a resource for you to understand all of the requirements our departments and our city suppliers must meet in order to comply with city laws. Again, these are very specific to Chapter 21 purchases for goods and services. That said, I highly recommend that you review these checklists so you can really begin to understand the full extent of city laws that may be applicable to the goods or services you as suppliers are providing. We really consider these checklists as the roadmap for the full life cycle of a purchase at the city. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to discuss the city's sourcing or solicitation process. Next slide. The city, as I'm sure you know, the city typically must use competitive bidding procedures to select or source the goods or services city departments need to operate. Competitive bidding is a process of issuing a public bid with the intent that companies will put together their best proposal and compete to provide a specific product or service. Competitive bidding creates a transparent environment that is open and fair. Some examples of competitive bidding solicitation types include low bid procurements, requests for proposals or RFPs, and requests for qualifications or RFQs. The regulations and procedures for sourcing and purchasing goods and services are primarily set forth in the following, some of which I've already discussed. The first is Chapter 21 of the San Francisco Administrative Code, which governs the acquisitions. This specifically covers the acquisition of commodities and services. Number 2 are the rules and regulations of Chapter 21 of the San Francisco Administrative Code. 3 is Chapter 14B of the San Francisco Administrative Code, which sets forth the regulations for utilization of local business enterprises, or LBEs, in contracts. And then number 4, the rules and regulations governing Chapter 14B. These regulations ensure that the city maintains fairness and transparency during the bidding and contracting process. As I've noted before, the Office of Contract Administration is responsible for overseeing and administering procurement of goods and services under Chapter 21, and the Contract Monitoring Division is responsible for oversight and administration of the Chapter 14B regulations. It's important to note that Chapter 21 and Chapter 14B of the Administrative Code are not the only regulations that govern purchasing. City procurement staff, suppliers should also familiarize themselves with a number of other administrative code chapters, including Chapter 19B, which relates to the procurement of surveillance technology, Chapter 12X, which prohibits the city from doing business with entities in certain states, Chapter 12U, which promotes sweatshop-free commodity purchasing, Environment Codes, Chapters 22 and 5, the city's green purchasing regulations, as well as other laws and policies related to sourcing and procurement. Again, procurement with the city is complex. There are many laws and regulations that apply to procurement, and it is useful and helpful for suppliers to really understand these in detail. I do want to point out that in prior slides, I specified other types of purchases, such as construction, contracting, and grants. So just as a reminder, those types of purchases are governed by different administrative codes and regulations, specifically Administrative Code Chapter 6 for construction, and the new Administrative Code Chapter 21G for grants. Next slide, please. Here, you'll see a pretty complex chart that provides a detailed breakdown of the solicitation and contracting requirements for various types of Chapter 21 goods and services procurements. The code sets forth specific contract threshold values. So these thresholds trigger certain contracting requirements and approvals depending on the type of contract. For example, for commodities and professional services, formal public solicitations are required for contracts valued above $129,000. This threshold value is sometimes called, or in the code is called, the minimum competitive amount. So below this value, this threshold value, the city may conduct an informal solicitation, which is typically less complex and speedier than a formal public solicitation. And then note here that no solicitation is required for any commodity, general service, or professional service purchase that is under $10,000. And I would like to point out at the far right of the table, you'll see general services. The threshold amount for a formal public solicitation for general services is in fact $706,000, not $129,000. And additionally, you'll see on this chart, the local business enterprise subcontracting requirements and bid discounts under Chapter 14B of the Administrative Code are also applied based on dollar thresholds. Finally, for contracts under the minimum competitive amount, these contracts are eligible to be micro LBE set-aside contracts, meaning that only city certified micro local business enterprises may compete for the contract. So I know this is a complex slide, and as mentioned before, these presentations will be shared with you so you can peruse these threshold values in more detail. Next slide. Chapter 21 of the Administrative Code does allow for competitive solicitations to be waived under certain circumstances. The circumstances under which solicitation requirements may be waived are based on several regulations in the code. For example, if there's only one source for the good or service, also referred to as a sole source, for proprietary articles, for pilot projects, as well as when we are using the results of another agency's competitive solicitation to procure goods and services. All waivers to a competitive solicitation must be submitted by the department requiring the goods or services, and those waivers must be approved by the Office of Contract Administration prior to the issuance of a contract or a purchase order to a supplier. Departments have to fully justify to OCA why the waiver should be granted, and they must cite the applicable section of the administrative code that allows the particular waiver requested. Next slide. So very briefly, I just want to touch on technology procurements, which are a pretty special type of good and service for the city. Purchasing technology goods and services can often prove to be a daunting task, as the rules and options available to city staff are varied and vast. And it is important for suppliers also to understand these rules and options. So here's just a brief overview of what you should generally understand if you are offering technology products and services. Our definition of technology goods and services includes computers, hardware, software systems, software maintenance, and telecommunications, amongst some other things. All digital products that contain or transmit data and or interact with the city's networks in some manner are deemed to be a technology purchase for the city. Again, all technology purchases must go through my office, the Office of Contract Administration. They are also subject to review by the city's Department of Technology. So technology purchases can never be completed through what I've called the Prop Q authority or delegated departmental authority, even if they're under $10,000. It's because they're, in general, a much higher risk transaction for the city. And then finally, I just want to point out technology purchases may be subject to the city's cybersecurity review requirements. Next slide. Before entering into contracts or making purchases with vendors for goods and services, it's crucial that bidders and suppliers know that the city may not do business with any vendor that does not comply with certain city regulations. Next slide, please. So our city legislators have put in place regulations that ensure we uphold the city's values when doing business with other entities, and to encourage social change through the city's spending power. As such, in order to receive a contract or purchase order with the city and County of San Francisco, suppliers are required to demonstrate that they comply fully with this set of laws that encompass the city's supplier-focused economic and social policies. The most prominent of these supplier-focused laws is the San Francisco Administrative Code, Chapter 12B, Equal Benefits Ordinance, which is enforced by the Contract Monitoring Division. The Equal Benefits Ordinance prohibits the city from entering into contracts or leases with entities that discriminate against their employees in the provision of benefits between employees with domestic partners and employees with spouses, or discriminate against employees or others that are members of a protected class. The Chapter 12B Equal Benefits Ordinance requires that all suppliers to the city administer benefits such as health insurance, retirement benefits, and paid leaves equally to their employees with domestic partners and their employees with spouses. Under the law, domestic partners are same-sex as well as opposite-sex couples that are registered with any authorized state or local government domestic partnership registry. Now, there are some exceptions to the 12B Equal Benefits Ordinance requirements that I've listed here. One is if the supplier is the sole source for the purchase of the good or service. Number two is if the city has never spent more than $5,000 with the supplier during any given fiscal year. And third, the supplier has chosen to comply only for certain business locations, also known as contract by contract compliance. Exceptions to the 12B Equal Benefits regulations require approval from the Contract Monitoring Division. So city departments that wish to conduct business with a vendor that does not comply with these requirements, for one of the reasons I just discussed, must submit a waiver request to CMD. City suppliers must also comply with the Treasurer and Tax Collector's Business and Tax Regulation Code, which requires every entity engaging in business with the city to complete business tax registration in order to determine the entity's tax responsibilities. Next slide. The Equal Benefits Ordinance and business tax regulations are not the only regulations that impact our purchasing and thus our suppliers. Depending on the type of purchase, suppliers may need to comply with additional regulations at the time of bidding and during performance of the contract. These regulations include Chapter 14B, the Local Business Enterprise Ordinance, which requires subcontracting to LBEs in certain instances. Administrative Code Chapter 12P, which is the city's minimum compensation ordinance. Administrative Code Chapter 12Q, which is the city's healthcare accountability ordinance. Administrative Code Chapter 12U, the sweat-free contracting provisions. Administrative Code Chapter 83, the city's first source hiring ordinance. And Chapter 21C, the city's prevailing wage requirements. It's very important for suppliers to understand these regulations and their applicability to different types of purchases prior to awarding contracts or purchasing from or supplying the city or doing business with the city. Next slide, please. So I know I covered many complex procurement topics and I didn't get into a lot of detail. Again, this is a Procurement 101. But I do want to note that other city departments will be providing more details regarding the specific requirements that I've mentioned during this training. Additionally, I'd like to point out here that OCA has many resources on our website that I believe will help guide you through these complex topics. So I highly recommend that you peruse these resources on our website. And you're always welcome to contact us directly if you have any questions. So thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sailaja, for the informative presentation. And we have a lot of questions coming in from our audience, so I'm just going to dive right in here.
Great.
So first question for you is, does my business need a supplier ID if the city is purchasing goods for my firm using a purchase order for a one-time purchase?
The answer to that question is yes. Every supplier that is providing goods and services to the city is required to obtain a supplier ID. And this occurs through the SF City Partner Portal. And I know that my colleagues at the Controller's Office soon will be providing you with an overview of the process for obtaining that supplier ID. I would like to point out, though, vendors are not required to obtain that supplier ID until they are awarded a purchase order or a contract with the city. So suppliers may, in fact, bid with the city without having that supplier ID in place. And there is also a process for obtaining what we call a bidder ID. And again, my colleagues at the Controller's Office will walk you through the steps for obtaining those different types of IDs.
Great, thank you. Next question coming in from Grace. Hi, I am a small city vendor. I don't have a website and I don't have a warehouse. Basically, my service is to act as an agent, helping to buy things for the city and charging a small service fee. I've been a city vendor for 10 years and I haven't received much business in that time, only a handful of orders. Is there a way that I can advertise my services and my company's listing in order to receive more purchases through my firm?
That's a really good question. My best recommendation really is for you to you're certainly welcome to reach out to different city departments regarding the services you provide. What I would note is that really the best thing to do to see what opportunities are available to you is to go to the SF City Partner website, where the Office of Contract Administration publicly advertises all of the solicitations for goods and services that our city departments need. I would like to note that so it really depends on what you are in fact offering to the city. So if you're offering goods and services, you can find opportunities at the SF City Partner site. However, certain departments do publicly advertise their solicitations on their own websites. So again, depending on what you're offering, if, for example, you're an engineering design firm, you might want to check the PUC's website or the DPW website as they may be offering their, providing their solicitations through those separate web portals.
All right, thanks, Shailaja. Our next question is coming in from Julia. Julia asks, how do we get on a mailing list to receive solicitations?
So again, this in some ways depends on what you are offering. If you are offering goods and services, the best way to be notified when there is an opportunity that you may wish to bid for is to register on the SF City Partner website, either as a bidder or as a full supplier. The Office of Contract Administration, as I mentioned, is responsible for the procurement of goods and services, and we do publicly post all of our solicitations on the SF City Partner website, and that system will automatically notify you when new solicitations become available based on the good or service that you provide. Again, if you're not, we do have somewhat of a decentralized system right now where some departments don't utilize the SF City Partner website. They have their own portals for solicitations. So I mentioned two examples before. The PUC and Public Works, as I believe, do advertise on their own portals. Professional services contracts that are issued specifically by the departments are sometimes issued directly by those departments, either through email or their own web portals. So if you have questions about how to find solicitations or opportunities related to your specific business, I do encourage you to reach out to the Office of Contract Administration, and we can better direct you to the correct resources. But I do want to reiterate, if you are providing goods and services, really the best way to get notified of opportunities is to register as a bidder or a supplier in the city's SF partner portal.
All right, thanks, Shailaja. We have a question coming in that's industry specific. So the question is, can you speak more about procurement for caterers, specifically smaller orders below the $10,000 threshold? What's the best way to get business in this area?
So this is a good question. We do have many departments that do require catering services. Because those departments have the authority to directly contract with any vendor under that Prop Q authority. Right now, I would say the best way is either to reach out to those agencies directly. You can also reach out to the Office of Contract Administration, and we can direct your information to those agencies that we know are requesting catering services. The Office of Contract Administration is working to get a contract in place for a contract pool in place for catering services. This may take some time, but if you provide your information to OCA to me via the email I provided in the presentation, we'd be happy to add you to our bidders list. And then again, registering with the SF City Partner website, you would be notified for any opportunities that are related to catering under the $10,000 threshold. I would like to note when the departments, because the departments have their own authority, in many respects, they are really, to streamline the purchasing, they are generally looking for compliant suppliers. So suppliers that have already gone through the compliance process, it really helps to speed up their purchasing. So it really does behoove you to become a registered city supplier, a compliant city supplier, so that you can be provided those opportunities for those small dollar values.
Great. Actually, this is a really good segue to the next question, which is around compliance. This person asks, I am a supplier in the system, but how often does the city check that I am compliant? And then if I fall out of compliance, do I receive any kind of notification so that I can become compliant again?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think the departments that administer these programs can answer better, but I will say the Chapter 12B requirement, which is the Equal Benefits Ordinance, that is the biggest compliance requirement at the time a vendor is, or the most complex requirement at the time a vendor is awarded a contract or a purchase order. So that compliance process takes place at the time you are working to get your supplier ID. That compliance process, the compliance with that requirement, as I understand, is reviewed every 3 years. So the department likely, the contract monitoring department likely will notify you if you have met that 3-year threshold and request recompliance, potentially request recompliance. Some of the other, in addition, the business tax regulations require that you recertify, re-register, update your tax certificate every year. And the business tax department can speak to that a little bit more, but generally you should know that the certificates are eligible or last until July of each fiscal year, our city's fiscal year. So you would generally have to recertify once per year just before June 30th, 2022 to ensure payments if you have a purchase order or a contract. Some of our other compliance requirements are really contract specific, and it really only requires in some instances that you certify that you will comply through certain documentation and attestations. And those, if your contract or purchase order is amended, the department will reach out to you to make sure that those are current attestations. And then finally, insurance requirements. I didn't touch on insurance requirements, but the city does require that vendors always have their evidence of insurance, current evidence of current insurance on file in order for us to make payment to you. And so at the time of payment, if your insurance is not current, the paying department will reach out to you to make sure that you provide the updated insurance documentation.
Great. Next question coming in from Nicole. Does the San Francisco have a procurement requirement around the Americans with Disabilities Act? And then if so, can you speak a little more about that?
Sure. I would like to say that there is a general requirement now, and I think the Mayor's Office of Disability may be able to speak to that a little bit more. So maybe we can respond with more detail in a written response. But I would like to note that San Francisco is about to adopt a more specific IT accessibility policy that will lead to more specific requirements in our procurements. Thank you.
Okay, great. A few more questions here. So this is also industry specific. When you spoke about technology purchasing, this person would like to know, can you describe more about the cybersecurity requirements that you mentioned with regard to technology purchasing?
Sure. So I'm sure you're aware the city uses many systems, and we also maintain a lot of very important data on our contractors, on our residents, et cetera, that must really remain secure and safe and secure. And so our Department of Technology has fairly recently, within the past year, implemented a cybersecurity technology review requirement. It doesn't apply to all technology purchases, but each technology purchase is assessed individually. And if the purchase meets a particular cybersecurity threshold, essentially in terms of the data and the system's connectivity that purchase would require, if there is essentially, if the city considers that system will create a high risk of data transmission that could be compromised, the Department of Technology will require that a vendor submit certain documentation to provide more information about the security policies and security features that they've implemented to ensure that the system it meets our cybersecurity standards. So generally, this cybersecurity doesn't happen before a bid is submitted or a proposal is submitted. It would generally happen after you've submitted a proposal to a solicitation. The Department of Technology would review those proposals and identify whether the cybersecurity review is needed. It does require, what I would recommend, in fact, is we very clearly, the Office of Contract Administration has very clearly outlined those requirements in the solicitation documents that we have made public on our website. And so I'd be happy to follow up and provide a specific link to those resources so you can really review those requirements. I also recommend that you check in on the Department of Technology's website to review specifically their cybersecurity policies.
Okay, thanks, Sailaja. Next is coming from Faye on YouTube. So you went through a lot of regulations during your presentation. It seems like there's, probably a system for larger firms who can have the resources to monitor them all. But do you have recommendations for smaller businesses on how to keep up with these regulations?
That's a very good question. And I agree, there are many complex regulations that are many times hard to translate. So the best that I can tell you right now, and I mentioned before that these regulations are administered by a few different departments. Our Office of Contract Administration website, we do provide updated resources when policies or regulations do change. We are also working on internally on assessing how we can better provide this information on these complex regulations to our suppliers. So it's a work in progress. At the moment, I would recommend for each of these policies that you visit the websites of the administering department. I've mentioned a few: the Contract Monitoring Division, obviously OCA, the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement, and the Treasurer and Tax Collector. Those are some of the key city departments where you can find more resources. And Nicole, maybe we can follow up and provide a quick summary on where departments can find this information.
Sure, definitely. We can work it into the presentation before we send out. This question, just throwing it out there from Monica via email, and it may be too good to be true, but is there any kind of a directory where you can find contacts within departments for who buys what we sell?
Yeah, good question. I'm not aware of any centralized resource for contact information of the purchasers at the city. Likely, most of the departments that do purchasing or contracting do have a website with an email that you can contact for more information. The OCA website certainly has a list of all of our staff, and so you're always welcome to get in touch with any of those purchasing staff, and they can help direct you to specific departments. But unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have a centralized resource of contact information. And as I mentioned before, I do think the best way to be notified of opportunities is really to register on the SF City Partner website to make sure that you're notified of goods and services opportunities.
All right, and this is probably just our last question, just given the time. We're at 10:48. So Eddie asks, what is the city policy about enhancing the chances of minority-owned businesses getting patronage?
That is a great question. I did mention a couple of things. First, the city has the local business enterprise program, which is administered through the Contract Monitoring Division under Chapter 14B of the city's administrative code. That program essentially allows small and local businesses of any type, but small and local businesses across the city, to become a certified local business enterprise. And that provides certain benefits to these small and local businesses, many of which across the city are minority owned, minority and women owned. Some of those benefits include what's called a bid discount. So when you issue a proposal or a bid for an offering that the city has, or a contract or purchase order the city is planning to issue, these certified local business enterprises, in fact, get a discount off of their bid, which helps them compete, helps them better compete against all the other non-local business enterprises. So that is really the best tool that we have for our small and local businesses to better compete on our opportunities. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, and I'll just add on to that, that if you're interested in learning more about the local business enterprise certification process, we have a dedicated workshop for it tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. And we'll also follow that up with another session talking specifically about opportunities that are available for smaller LBEs to start off as subcontractors to primes working with the city. And so that'll be a really good afternoon session tomorrow if you're interested in that.